Before I get started, I apologize for how my voice sounds in this video. I've been talking a lot for the past few days, and my voice is a little strained because of that. Bloodstained started out as just kind of a love letter sort of Kickstarter game, and is now turning into a franchise. There's Ritual of the Night, the main game, the spin-off Curse of the Moon that actually released before Ritual did. And now, just kind of randomly with an announcement a week or two ago, Curse of the Moon got a sequel. Here is my review of Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 for the Nintendo Switch. Now, before we start the story section, it's worth noting that there isn't really a canonical connection between the Curse of the Moon games and Ritual of the Night. There's also very little connection between Curse of the Moons 1 and 2, so if you wanted to dive into this game without playing the first one, you could. Sometime after the events of Curse of the Moon, the swordsman Zangetsu is recruited by Dominique of the Church to take out an army of demons, though being brought in and used as bait is probably a little bit closer than recruited. He then goes on a journey with her and two other allies to take out this new demonic army, much like he did with Miriam, Alfred, and Gebel in the first game. Despite Curse of the Moon 2 being set up like an NES game in terms of story with very few scenes per episode, there's honestly a good amount of character development here, with the main cast going from not being sure if they can trust one another to being brothers and sisters in arms. When it comes to gameplay, Curse of the Moon 2 is a 2D action platformer set up in the vein of NES Castlevania games, particularly Castlevania 3. As you play the game, you'll be navigating a lot of 2D areas, platforming, fighting enemies, and swapping between multiple playable characters. This is the same style they went with for Curse of the Moon 1, but a new feature they added for the sequel is the ability for someone to pick up a second controller, hit some buttons, and do 2-player couch co-op. Now when you play Curse of the Moon 2, the game is set in episodes, and in each episode you tackle the game's 8 stages and get story segments going from one episode to the next. You also set difficulty settings when starting an episode between Veteran, which lets you have retro knockback and a limited number of lives, and Casual, where there's no knockback upon being hit by enemies and you have infinite lives for respawning at checkpoints. Once you actually dive into the game, it plays very much like a classic Vania. It is stage-based with multiple recruitable characters that can join your party as you go along. Now all of these characters have different abilities for different situations. For example, Zangetsu is good for normal sword attacks and very Castlevania-like sub-weapons. Dominique is better at angled attacks and maneuverability, Robert at ranged sniping and crawling under obstacles, and Hachi for hovering over large gaps. And as you might guess, each stage also has a lot of secret areas that require specific characters' abilities to be able to access. The great thing about this character system is that you can swap on the fly, allowing you to constantly swap between playable characters to manage health as well as getting into situations where you might need someone else. Now when we get into the game flow, every stage is filled with enemies and obstacles for you to get past, along with a lot of stair and door transitions, all leading up to a boss fight. And the bosses themselves all have very interesting and unique designs, a few of which were actually taken from Ritual of the Night and repurposed in this game. Now when you get through all of this and finally beat that 8th boss in stage 8, you see the credits roll, but the game is far from over. That's when the episode system comes in. The game has 3 to 4 episodes across its story, and each of them takes you through the game's 8 stages. The story just changes up what characters you have available and what's going on in the story as you go back through those stages. And this system has some ups and downs. On one hand, each episode gives you different characters and earlier opening up secret paths that you couldn't go through before. There's even an episode in mode that opens up the cast of the original Curse of the Moon, allowing you to recruit Alfred, Gebel, and Miriam back into the party. The downside to this is you're repeating the same 8 stages and 7 of the same bosses 3 to 4 times in a row before the game is over. It is nice to be able to tackle them with different characters and under different conditions, but at the end of the day, it's the same 7 bosses again and again and again. And speaking of the bosses, let's talk about the game's difficulty. Curse of the Moon 1 and wasn't really that overwhelmingly hard for a game that was mimicking NES Castlevania games. Curse of the Moon 2 is. The first 3 or 4 stages are difficult but not really that overwhelming, but when you get to the second half of the game, it really amps up that NES. You've got to stop and learn these bosses' patterns to be able to survive difficulty. It's also around that point where the bosses start using last-ditch effort attacks, where when their health runs down to 0, they'll use one last attack to try to take you out. Now, is this difficulty unfair? No, not really. As much as I would love to argue that the Stage 7 boss is, it's one of those games where once you fight a boss a few times and learn their patterns, they go from being very difficult to pretty easy. And of course, the game has some features that help you with the difficulty as well. With the party system, when you die, whatever character you were playing as is killed, and you respawn at the previous checkpoint with the characters you have left. If this is done in the middle of a boss fight, the boss will only regenerate a little bit of their health when you go back and re-challenge them. And speaking of health, all of the lanterns you come across the game that drop health, weapon points, and power-ups are exploitable. If you find a lantern that drops a really big health drop, it will always drop that, so all you need to do is find a stair transition to a previous room, go back, and that lantern will infinitely respawn so you can refill everybody's health, weapon points, or whatever that lantern contains. And with all of this coming together, let's talk about content and length. The first episode you go through should take you about 3 hours from start to finish, and the later episodes should only take you about 2 to 2.5 hours. That'll give you about 8 to 9 hours by the time you reach the true ending. Now let's dive into presentation. Visually, this game looks right on par with those NES Castlevania games, but with a lot of extra stuff going on in the background. For what it's trying to emulate, it looks very nice. I don't really have any complaints about performance. The frame rate was nice and smooth and it never froze or crashed on me, so now let's get into battery life. On the original model, Curse of the Moon 2 has a battery range of 4 hours and 56 minutes up to 6 hours and 23 minutes. On the Nintendo Switch Lite, it has a range of 5 hours and 5 minutes up to 6 hours and 58 minutes. And on the V2 or Redbox 2019 model, it has a range of 6 hours and 49 minutes up to 10 hours and 13 minutes. In conclusion, Curse of the Moon 2 shows that Bloodstained is still great at creating Castlevania experiences both new and old. Now on the downside, the episode system does get a bit repetitive with repeating the same stages and bosses so much across the storyline, but if you're a fan of NES Classicvania or just want a new adventure in the Bloodstained series, this is a great platformer to trek through. Reviews to go. Rates Bloodstained Curse of the Moon 2 for the Nintendo Switch a 9 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.